So I'm excited to share and discuss some tales from the Talmud. I was excited when Rabbi Mati suggested this as a next course switch off because there are a lot of great stories in the Talmud. Just a 2-second just historical background, because the historian mind in me, can't go into any text without giving some background just as review. I know everybody here is intimately familiar with what I'm about to say, but just in case, the Talmud is a massive 3,000 plus page work of dense, mostly legal, but also what we call Aggadic, which can roughly translate into narrative or almost mythical type literature that was produced by the Jewish community, both in Israel and also in Babylonia between the 1st and 7th century CE. So this is at a time when the temple was destroyed by the Roman Empire and Judaism and Jews were spreading out throughout the world. And there was a need to do two things at the same time, which ended up producing the Talmud. One, there was a need to consolidate a lot of the practices that were passed down orally. So one way to think of this is, imagine in some alternative universe where the Jewish community all had to leave Fullerton and everybody was going off their different ways. There's a lot of oral tradition to our community in Fullerton, and not everything's written down. And so people that have been a part of the Temple Beth Tikva community for 10, 20, 30, 40 years have a lot of innate knowledge that ends up getting passed down to new members, but there's no book that you can read that in. And so one need for the Talmud arising was to say, okay, there was a time when the entire Jewish world was centralized around Jerusalem, and everybody knew if you want answers, you go to either the temple in Jerusalem or the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin, or during times that there was a Jewish king, during the Hashmonai dynasty, you go to the king, right? Now the Jews are going to spread out. We need a way to write all this down. That then came with the additional challenge of, okay, Judaism is spreading out. You're no longer going to have the temple as your dominant mode for worshiping and for practicing Judaism. And everything that Sydney is teaching in Torah study now in the book of Samuel really starts off this temple-centric Judaism that the Talmud needed to account for. And so the first half of the Talmud, consolidating of these oral traditions, and the second half of the Talmud is these religious innovations that allows Judaism to have relatively seamlessly, in an incredible way, have transitioned from everything that you get when you read Samuel and Kings and the prophets and Leviticus and Deuteronomy to celebrating Judaism now that seem based off of the Tanakh in some way, but different enough that if anybody, right, one of the funny things that I always say whenever talking about the Talmud is a lot of times when I'll have students, or just in general, when people say are interested in learning more about Judaism, or somebody might be interested in converting to Judaism, and they'll come to me and say, I'm really interested in Judaism. I read the entire Torah, cover to cover. And my answer always is, that's like saying, I want to be a good constitutional lawyer, so I memorized Constitution, which, maybe
Oh, no, you got to memorize the Constitution and everything else. That's not...
Sure. And so as Mitch said, right, I threw that example in just for you, right? It's important, right? And you're going to not be able to understand the 200 years or 300 years of debate on any substantive issue without understanding the base text. But if you only, if you try showing up to court today and all you know is the Constitution, you're going to be quite lost, which is exactly how the Talmud functions in Jewish literature. And so with that, we get a lot of fascinating stories, because the Talmud is not just dense legal material, although it is a lot of dense legal material, but you also get the narratives of Jews and rabbis that are spread out between Israel and Babylonia and everywhere in between, and trying to wrestle with all of the same things that Jewish community is wrestling with now. And so we get what I believe is one of the more interesting stories. And I'll start off with a somewhat of a legal debate, because we have Mitch here, so I have to include a little bit of law. But this legal debate quickly turns into narrative form. And so this is in Tractate Chagiga, which is in theory, and I say in theory because you realize how much, the rabbis of the Talmud and the compilers of the Talmud, you really see the ADHD type mindset breathe through when you learn Talmud, because you're never staying on one subject for more than a couple of lines before you bring up something totally random. Chagiga comes from the word chag, right? We all recognize the word chag meaning a holiday. And so if one pays close attention to the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Vayikra and Devarim, every time that there's a holiday, you bring a special holiday offering, and that is the way that you celebrate your holiday. So this is supposedly an entire Talmudic tractate about the laws of this offering. The rabbis very quickly go on a tangent and start talking about what they deem to be matters that are of such heightened importance that you have to be very careful in terms of the context in which you discuss them. So I'll start off, and then I think it'll be clear. So the Mishnah starts off and says, one may not expound the topic of forbidden sexual relations between 3 or more individuals. And so if you want to give a class about exactly what is considered a kosher and not kosher sexual relation, you shouldn't give that to a whole room. Why? There's some debate about why, but generally the accepted answer, if anyone here has another answer, I would love to hear it, but generally the accepted answer is that these are things that are of the utmost importance. And oftentimes, if you're in a room with many people, things can be lost in translation. And so, the difference between if you're lecturing in front of 200 people and there isn't time for back and forth and questions, somebody could misunderstand something. Usually, if you sit down with one other person or 2 other people and you're giving very specifics and they are confused, you'll be able to tell that. And so the rabbis start off by talking about sexual relations, and then they get into what's going to be important for our conversation. Nor may one expound the act of creation and the secrets of the beginning of the world before 2 or more individuals. So if you are discussing the account of creation, it can only be one-on-one. And so the rabbis, again, and this is a fascinating piece of Mishnah here, because the Mishnah was written or compiled in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries CE. This is exactly the same time when works of Plato and works of Aristotle that, of course, are slightly older, are starting to be translated throughout the Roman Empire. And this is exactly the time when Jews would have come into contact with, say, Aristotle's theory that the universe is infinite, instead of the account in Genesis that the universe was created. And so the rabbis are saying, okay, if you're going to discuss esoteric matters about the creation of the world, it has to be one-on-one. And then they go on, nor may one expound by designing by oneself the design of the divine chariot. I don't know if in Torah study you'll ever make it to the book of Ezekiel, but if you do and you read the 1st chapter of the book of Ezekiel, you get a fascinating description of Ezekiel seeing God in a chariot, and there's different animals, and there's animals with human faces, and all sorts of fascinating things there. And then, Cindy, I'll take your question or thought in 1 second, right? This is such an important and potentially dangerous, right? There's a lot of sentiment of danger here. This is a dangerous topic to the extent of you are not allowed to study it yourself. So don't go home and open up, mystical books and try to understand, these esoteric accounts, because if you do it by yourself, unless you are wise, there could be potential dangers there. Cindy, go for it.
Yeah, I just had a question about it, is that I knew somewhere there were rules that you can't study by yourself because you'll go off at some bad tangent. But is 2 enough, or what did that have to do with having a minyan where you had enough people to keep everybody on track and in the right direction, versus something like this where now it has to be even smaller than a minyan?
Yeah. I think you're touching on the tension, because they're worried about 2 things. One, if you're talking to too many people at once, things are going to be lost in translation, or what probably also happens where people get distracted, right? If you're in a room with 100 people, you're a lot more likely to strike a conversation with your neighbor about something related than if you're in a one-on-one conversation or a 2-on-1 conversation, right?
And you may not want to ask questions if there's too many people, then you don't get it, and you're like, well, everybody else seems to get it. So the smaller it is, the more you're willing to ask questions and then get the right answer. But then you could 2 people could go in a weird direction as much as one sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that
100%.
why, we primarily study Talmud? Those who study Talmud, like you do it one-on-one. It's just the 2 of you going back and forth, so the debate is open. You may never get to an ultimate conclusion because you're not before the Sanhedrin. But when you're studying, at least the study is open, and the dialogue is to dig deeper and deeper. rather than doing the typical yeshiva, the broader yeshiva classroom in which the professor's giving the lecture and then the two people pair off. It's sort of like in a science class and do it one-on-one. Isn't almost all of it one-on-one, Dave?
Yeah, almost all of it is one-on-one. You're totally right, which is very different than the sort of dominant Socratic method, right? Of, you know, one person in the front of the classroom, open, engaging questions, right? Talmud is much more, you know, again, this two-way street, and really you try not to have a hierarchy because you don't want to preempt anyone's conclusion. And a lot of these ideas are shining through here. And then the Mishnah concludes, and then we'll get into our fun story after. I promised you a tale, not a legal debate. So the Mishnah concludes, and this is the subject of endless fascinating academic debate that I don't want to have now just because that'll take us too much on a tangent. But if anyone's interested in this, we should talk after, because there's a whole interesting debate about the rabbis' interaction with Greek philosophy. But this seems to be a very anti-philosophic statement in the Mishnah, because the rabbis conclude this Mishnah by saying, whoever looks into four matters, it would have been better for them to never have entered the world. So there are four things that you should never spend time contemplating. Anyone who reflects upon what is above the firmament, so if you speculate on what is beyond the heavens, anyone who reflects on what is below the earth, so if you reflect on what is sort of at the core of the earth, what was before creation and what will be after the end of the world. Now, there are a lot of ways to understand this. I'll give the two different ways. It's almost opposite ways, and then we can spend 2 minutes discussing this, and we'll actually move on to the story that everyone here was promised. One way, the anti-philosophic way, is to say, listen, if you start going down this rabbit hole and contemplating creation and contemplating, what's above the heavens, you might end up with conclusions that don't match with the Jewish conclusions. So it's better, keep your science and philosophic textbooks at home, right? That is the anti-philosophic way to read it. The other way to read it is to say, a lot of religions claim to have answers to these questions. And if any religious teacher or philosophic teacher says, trust me, I know what happens at the end of the world, right? I'm lying because I don't. And so don't trust, right? So either this is a check on religious authority and don't think that there is any person in society that knows everything, or it is an anti-philosophic, right? This is a huge academic debate. I don't want to have that now because I want to get into the story, because generally what happens in the second half of the Talmud, so the Gemara, is the rabbis try to debate all of the ins and outs. So, a typical Gemara question would be, what if the third person is sleeping? Does that count? Is it okay if you have two people awake, right? All the nitty gritty. Instead, the rabbis take us into this fascinating narrative of a first century sage named Elisha ben Avuya, or otherwise known by Acher. I'm sure people have heard of him in various contexts before, but I wanted to run through some of these wider stories of Acher, who in Hebrew literally means the other, because this is a story of a rabbi in Jewish tradition that ended up, as the Talmud will say in a second, chopping down the saplings, meaning severing all roots that he has, so leaving tradition, but yet still emerging a major figure in the rabbinic tradition. So it's a fascinating story. So here is sort of the prototypical origin story of Elisha ben Avuya, and then we can go into, this is about 2 pages of Talmud discussing the entire story of Elisha ben Avuya. So here is what happens. The rabbis taught. There were 4 rabbis who entered Pardes, right? Very unclear what Pardes is. Obviously, it's from the Greek word paradise. Very unclear what paradise means, right? Perhaps this is some type of scientific introspection, right? Greek philosophy. Perhaps this is some sort of mysticism, right? You're entering into some sort of, mental paradise, right? Unclear what this is, but there were 4 rabbis who attempted to enter into paradise, right? Whether internally, externally, right? You can have your own decisions, and they are the 4 rabbis, Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to them, when you reach near the pure marble stones, do not say water, water, because it is said, a speaker of lies shall not abide before my eyes. Again, what that exactly means, subject to a lot of debate, but Rabbi Akiva seemingly is telling them before they go on this experience, whatever it is, you're going to see something that's going to be misleading, right? You're going to see marble, and you're going to think it's water. But don't make that mistake, right? Don't trust your own senses and your own immediate conclusions, because it's going to mislead you. Obviously, they didn't listen, because here's what happened. Ben Azai glanced and died. So Rabbi 1 sees this, has this experience, goes into Pardes and dies. And again, the Talmud likes to be hyperbolic. So, endless debate. Did this ever happen? Is this representative of something that happened, right? That debate aside, Ben Azai looks, he dies. Ben Zoma glanced and went crazy, right? So Rabbi 1 couldn't take the shock, right? It was such a heightened experience, either an ecstatic, mystical experience, or a deep philosophic experience, or a crushing philosophic experience, that he dies. Ben Zoma glances and goes insane. Acher chopped down the sapling. So our third rabbi becomes a heretic, right? Chops his roots. And Rabbi Akiva, who ends up being the sort of hero of the Mishnah, right? He's the most quoted rabbi all throughout the Mishnah. He emerges in peace. So, okay. The question is, of course, what is happening here, right? What is this wider story representing? So before getting into some of the later theories in the Talmud, because this is something the rabbis are going to spend a lot of pages trying to tell this in narrative form, I'm curious to open this up. What is reaching out to you here? What is the story? What is this metaphor? No one wants to mistake the marble for the water here.
I'm just guessing that the marble stones you're reaching what you think is the purity of light. And when you try to look at it, you'll never be able to understand it. So either you leave it like Acher did, or you find a way to live with purity and emerge like Rabbi Akiva did. The others didn't know how to deal with what purity looked like.
I see.
That's
So
the
it's almost, yeah, no, I really like that, which is actually in a lot of literature about mysticism, right? It's this constant paradox. Martin Buber wrote a lot about this, right? Martin Buber's whole thesis was there are two types of relationships you have. One is I-it relationships, which is how we relate to most things most of the time, right? So when I relate to objects or people, you objectify them in some way, but the goal of a relationship, whether with God or with other humans, is to get to what he calls an I-thou relationship, where you're not thinking about the other person or object or God in terms of any descriptive factors or anything like that, but just purely be in their presence. But the paradox is, the second you recognize that you are having that experience, you end up leaving that experience. And so it's almost, if you ever, I actually feel this a lot, whenever oftentimes I feel this way on Yom Kippur, where you'll be praying, something will be very moving during the service, and I'll think to myself, wow, this is really deep, and then I've lost it, right? So it's almost like this paradox of deep experiences. Any other thoughts here?
I don't know. I was kind of thinking about the search for like El Dorado, where you're just so focused on something so beyond that you lose all connection with what's really rooted for you and what's really important, and your morals, your day-to-day life, anything. And so they kind of lost their contact with all of this and either went insane or just lost their direction. And it took Rabbi Akiva, who is so rooted in Judaism, that it didn't trick him, it didn't confuse him, he didn't lose sight of what was really fundamentally important, which is Judaism.
Yeah, I love it. So the rabbis take this, and they're obviously very confused by this statement, because how could it be that these three great sages, except for Rabbi Akiva, all are hurt by this? And so they, in typical Talmud fashion, right, they want to try to probe this, and they want to try to tell stories here. So the rabbis are commenting on this line, Acher chopped the sapling. So the rabbis ask, what is this, right? So what is happening here? What is the story? So here is one answer in the Talmud, right? And we start the story of Acher. He went and he saw the angel Midatron, who had permission to sit and write the merits of Israel. So he goes on this internal, maybe mystical experience and goes up to the heavens, and he sees an angel, right, Metatron, who is a very central character in later Kabbalistic literature, but he does appear every once in a while in the Talmud. He's sort of seen as God's scribe in some sense. And he says, Acher is talking to this angel, there is a tradition. Above, there is no sitting, no copying, no turning one's back, and no tiredness among the angels, yet Metatron was sitting. Maybe, heaven forbid, there are two gods. So Acher shows up and he sees this angel, in very, you imagine any cartoon or movie you've ever watched about, the gates of heaven, and you have the angel sitting there at the front desk taking names. Acher sees that angel and says, oh my goodness, how is it that this angelic being seems like a godlike figure? Maybe there are two gods. So what happens? They took Metatron out and gave him 60 lashes of fire. They said to him, what is your reason that when you saw him, you did not stand before him? So the other angels, right, again, extremely strange what exactly is happening here. The other angels are giving this one angel a bunch of lashes, and they said, why, when you saw Acher, when he came to visit heaven, did you not stand, right? Why not humor him, right? Why did you show him the divine secrets that, there are angels that maybe are interacting with God? Again, very unclear on a philosophic level what's happening, but it says he had permission to erase the merits of Acher. And so there was something about this angel that he actually wanted to confuse Acher in some sense, right? That was the goal. So a heavenly voice went out and said, return, return, rebellious children, which is a famous verse in Jeremiah, except for Acher. And so Acher, right, this is characteristic of an internal mystical experience gone awry, because it's very unclear exactly what's happening on a philosophic level, but Acher is having this mystical experience. He's seeing different gods. He thinks there are two gods. He then starts hearing this voice from heaven that says, all children might, can return except for me. And then he says to himself, seeing as I was banished from the world to come, I should go out and enjoy myself in this world. So Acher says, okay, God has given up on me, or I've given up on God. I might as well enjoy this world, right? So what happens? Acher became ill-cultured. He went out and found a harlot. So, next day, right, in his enjoyment of the world, he finds a harlot. She says to him, are you not Elisha, the son of Avuya, right? Are you not the sage? Aren't you the rabbi, right? Strange for a rabbi to go visit the town harlot. So he uprooted a radish from a patch on Shabbat, right? Something that you are not supposed to do on Shabbat is pick vegetables, and gave it to her. And she said, you must not be Elisha ben Avuya, you're someone else, Acher, right? You're another person, which is how he became this, he got this nickname of Acher, right? Another person. And so, right, answer one in the Talmud of mystical experience gone awry, right? Acher ending up being this person who reached mystical ecstasy a little bit too far and ended up being confused. I want to do one more source, and then I would love to unpack this a little bit, and the story goes on a little bit, and it's a fascinating ending as well. But the Talmud in another place, right, is uncontent with that answer. And so the rabbis ask again in a different place, what caused Acher to sin, right? So we have story one, what caused him to sin was this internal mystical experience. Here the rabbis give a much more cut and dry, almost philosophic legal answer. And they said, with regard to honoring one's father and mother, it says that your days may be long and then it may go well with you, right? So we know from Deuteronomy that it says, if you want to live a long time, you should honor your parents, right? Or the other way around, if you honor your parents, the reward is a long life. With regard to the dispatch of the mother's bird from the nest, it says that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days. So there's also a law in Deuteronomy that if you come across, if you want some eggs for dinner, you should scare away the mother bird so that you don't pain the mother seeing you taking her eggs. And the reward for that in the Deuteronomy is also, you do this and you will live a long life. Okay, that's the background. It occurred that there was one whose father said, so climb to the top of the building and fetch me chicks. And he climbed to the top of the building and dispatched the mother bird and took the young, thereby simultaneously fulfilling the mitzvah to dispatch the mother bird from the nest and the mitzvah to honor one's parents, but upon his return, he fell and died. So Acher one day was walking down the street, sees somebody doing both at the same time, right? Honoring his parents and also doing this other mitzvah of scaring away the mother bird that promises you long days, and saw the child die. Acher says, where is the goodness of the days of this one, and where is the length of days of this one, right? So, oh my goodness, right? Acher is saying, the Torah is wrong. The Torah promised I would have long days if you do these two things. Somebody who was doing these two things died as a result of it. So story number 2 for Acher is he goes through this religious crisis, right? Perhaps we can say a religious crisis built on too much biblical literalism, and he ends up leaving Jewish tradition because of it. Now, I just want to say how interesting it is, just from a Jewish perspective, these stories are included within the Talmud. I mean, the rabbis, you could almost hear the rabbis begging people, right, don't make this same mistake, or perhaps, struggling with their own tension of, it kind of does seem like if the Torah promises long life for mitzvah A, that doesn't always map onto reality. But just as an interesting out there. And then we get one last story, and then we'll discuss all 3 of these, because of course you never have just 2 opinions in the Talmud. You always need a third. So the rabbis ask in another place, Acher, what was his failing? So the rabbis are really, really confused by this guy. The answer is Greek tunes never ceased from his mouth. He would constantly sing Greek songs, even when he was among the sages. This shows that from the outset, he was drawn to Gentile culture and beliefs. Similarly, they said about Acher, when he would stand up after learning in the study hall, many heretical books, which he had been reading, would fall from his lap. Therefore, he was somewhat unsound even when among the sages. So this third opinion says, perhaps it wasn't a mystical crisis, perhaps it wasn't a biblical literalism crisis, right? Acher always had an affinity for Greek philosophy. Again, this is at a time, right? If we all, of course, remember the Hanukkah story that happened about 150 years before Acher lived, which was quite literally a battle about Greek ideas versus Jewish ideas. You can imagine a lot of Jews were very interested in Aristotle and Plato and that tradition that was circulating around the Middle East during that time. And so Acher just happened to be, right, whenever he would show up to Torah study Shabbat morning, he would be hiding his copy of Plato underneath his Torah. And so what do you expect? Well, of course, he's going to end up leaving tradition. Okay, 3 opinions about Acher. Thoughts? And then don't worry, we got a good end to the story here.
Well, it seems that these 3 philosophies are just all ways to find a different theory upon which Acher failed by their standard to have belonged in parties, and his failing when he had the potential to go parties is based on any one of these 3 stories of saying, well, he questioned God because when bad things happen to good people, if you can't tolerate it and recognize we don't know the answer, etc., he went into Greek philosophy. They're basically trying to find a rationality that says, if the story of Acher is true, and this is a guy who cut the roots, he cut the roots from his system because he saw either A, bad things happen to good people, B, he was influenced by Greek theology, or he just didn't know how to get there.
Yeah.
It's like finding an excuse for Acher. Why do we have to find an excuse? Acher decided to become a heretic, but you could still be a good. Again, the principal question was, can a heretic still be a good Jew?
It's a great question, and I think these sources are really wrestling with it in 2 ways. And after the last one, you'll really see the sort of interesting conclusion that the Talmud comes to. It seems like what they're more upset with is not that his beliefs cut the roots, but that therefore he then led his life in a way that was not a Jewish way of living. And so it, at least in the first source, right, they're not upset that he became a polytheist, right? That he saw multiple gods. They're upset that because of that, he then went out and led what the Talmud called an ill-cultured lifestyle. So there still is, right, that interesting, right, action over belief, which has always been sort of a central Jewish idea. But the rabbis here are struggling, right? Again, the other obvious thing that's simmering in the background here is the Talmud, right? Acher lived, and Rabbi Akiva and this whole cohort, they lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century CE in Jerusalem. So let's just use a round number, the year 100 CE. These stories in the Talmud, these were written in the Babylonian Talmud in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century. So these are now stories being written down 200 to 400 years after Acher lived. So either there were these traditions about Acher, right? That's certainly a plausible theory. Or this is later rabbis trying to make sense of knowing that there was this great sage who one time, went off and severed connection to tradition. So it's interesting what's happening there. They also could have just ignored it, meaning the rabbis were well aware, right? There were a lot of different worldviews, right? The most obvious example is Paul and early Christians. The rabbis were well aware of early Christianity. I mean, Paul was a Pharisee before he, right, Shaul of Tarsus, right? He's not quoted in the Talmud, but it's clear that he's coming from that same mentality of the exact same time period of all of these rabbis. So the Mishnah and Talmud seems to completely ignore any discussion about Christians, right? It's not really until the Middle Ages where you see, real Jewish engagement with Christians and Christian ideas and, all of that. But here the rabbis seem really interested in discussing this issue, which in my mind, again, my analysis could be wrong, but it shows that the rabbis are describing a little bit more of their own personal, discomfort, right? I can imagine it was a lot more enticing in the 4th century for a rabbi to internalize Greek philosophy or mysticism than it was for them to dabble in Christianity. I just don't think Christianity was not that enticing of a worldview for a lot of Jews in the 3rd and 4th century, but Greek philosophy was, because that was the, be all and end all. So yeah, I really liked that question. And let's go to the last source, because you'll really see that. I'm going to scroll just past this, this other source. The other source, just to real quick. So Acher, before he became a heretic, he had a student who was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir ends up being, again, the next great leader of the Jerusalem community. And one of the interesting things that the last source talked about, and this source picks up on it, is that even after Acher became a heretic, his chief student, Rabbi Meir, continued to learn Torah from him. So again, you get just fascinating dynamics of, the leader of the community, Acher, became a heretic. He's now off, visiting harlots and reading Greek philosophy and wants nothing to do with Judaism. But the next leader of the Jewish community is still attending, his Torah study classes. So here is a fascinating story. It once happened that Acher was riding on a horse on Shabbat, right? Traditional Shabbat laws, right? You're not supposed to ride horses on Shabbat. And Rabbi Meir was walking behind him to learn Torah from his mouth. First of all, just an incredible one, right? Acher is breaking Shabbat, right, according to traditional Shabbat laws of 2,000 years ago. And his student, Rabbi Meir, is walking behind him because, of course, he's not going to ride a horse on Shabbat because he wants to learn Torah. He says,
driving a car in the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly, right? You can imagine, right, fascinating, right? Or even, the rabbi eating a cheeseburger, right? There's all sorts of fascinating ways to make this modern. So he says to him, meaning Acher says to Rabbi Meir, Meir, turn around. So you as a student, turn around. I have calculated with my horse's steps that until here is the Tehum Shabbat. So a little bit of a legal background. There's a concept in the laws of Shabbat called the Tehum Shabbat. The Tehum Shabbat stipulates that you are not allowed to go the distance of 2,000 cubits outside of any city or village. And so, right, if you imagine in Fullerton, as long as there is housing developments, that all counts as Fullerton. But the second there is sort of no man's land, you're not allowed to travel more than about half a mile outside of that distance. And so the heretic, Acher, is telling his student, you have to stop here. You'll be breaking Shabbat if you keep walking. So Meir says to him, you too, right? You also, right? You're presumably, Jewish. You're, Acher, you should return and repent, right? So now the student who is following the teacher, learning Torah on Shabbat, is begging his teacher to repent. He says to him, have not I already told you, I have already heard from behind the divine curtains, return, rebellious sons, except for Acher, right? So Acher says, no, I already, right, in this first mystical vision, I'll just make another paragraph so it's easier to see. In this first mystical experience I had, I heard from the divine that I'm not welcome back. So he brought him to a house of study. So Meir says, I'm bringing you to a house of study. And they go to a child who's learning Torah. Tell me the verse that you learned today, right? So they go to a child that's in the Beit Midrash, in the house of study, and Acher goes to a child and says, what are you learning? Right? Again, just fascinating dynamics of what's happening here. And he quotes a verse from Isaiah, there is no peace, God has said, for the wicked, right? So presumably, right, again, a lot of coincidence here or a lot of divine orchestration, right? The child is learning a verse about the wicked, right? He brought him to another house of prayer. He said to a child, tell me the verse that you learned today. He said from Jeremiah, even if you wash with natron and you use much soap, your sin is sustained before me. And so Acher, again, a lot to make of this, but they're going to the study houses and they're studying the texts from the prophets, and text after text are about how Acher is condemned to, not be able to repent. Again, a lot of fascinating commentary here about, maybe the rabbi's ambivalence of some of the harsher words in the Tanakh, right? There's a lot going on here, but just to continue the story and then we can unpack it. When Acher died, so eventually, Acher dies, they said to him, and this is to Mitch's point before, we cannot judge him to punishment in Gehenna, but we cannot enter him into the world to come, right? So they, and again, they presumably being the heavenly court, is saying, we don't know what to do with this guy. We can't send him to Gehenna, right? Because he was a righteous man, and we can't enter him into heaven because he was a heretic. We cannot judge him to punishment because he toiled in Torah. We cannot enter him into the world to come because he sinned. So what should we do? So Rabbi Meir, again, his student, says, it is better that they sentence him so as to purge him of his sins, and he should go to the world to come afterwards. When I die, I will raise smoke from his grave, right? Unclear what that means exactly, but Rabbi Meir is entering into this heavenly debate somehow, or perhaps this is actually the Sanhedrin that's debating about whether or not you should go to heaven. But what's clear is that Acher dies, and there's some debate about this guy's legacy. Does he merit heaven? Does he merit Gehenna? Right? What's happening? And Rabbi Meir, his student, is fiercely advocating on his behalf. And he says maybe he should go to some sort of purgatory to purge him of his sins. Again, unclear if Jews believe in purgatory, but that's clearly what Rabbi Meir is insinuating here. And when I die, I'll try to save him. So what happens? When Rabbi Meir passed away, smoke came out from the grave of Acher, right? So Rabbi Meir eventually also passes away. The generations are changing, and all of a sudden smoke is coming out from his grave. Rabbi Yochanan said, is it a feat to burn one's teacher? And so the next generation is critical, and they say, what is Meir doing? What is with the smoke? There was one between us Torah scholars, can we not save him? If I took him in the hand and let him out of Gehenna, who would stop me? He says, when I die, I will douse the smoke from his grave. When Rabbi Yochanan passed away, the smoke ceased from the grave of Acher. Okay, now it's getting a little bit weird. I see Mitch shaking his head in disapproving confusion. This is it's very cryptic.
Confusion, not disapproving.
Yes. I am also, I read this about 6 times 2 hours ago. I'm still trying to make sense of exactly the back and forth, but Rabbi Meir presumably didn't want, right, the way I made sense of it is Rabbi Meir did not want Acher to pass away and go unremembered. And so he says, when I die, I'm going to ensure that there is smoke coming out of his grave. So Israel, right, the nation knows this was a great sage. And then the next generation, Rabbi Yochanan, said, that seems disrespectful, right? So when I die, I will make sure that there is no more smoke, right? But this fascinating debate going on of even post-mortem, the difficult and almost paradoxical legacy of being, balanced on, okay, we can't, we're not going to condemn him to Gehenna. We're not going to put him into heaven. Rabbi Meir is advocating for him. He's learning from him. Acher clearly feels that he's not being reaccepted by the Jewish community. And so all of these fascinating dynamics, just to finish off the story here, and then we can hopefully unpack a little bit of it. So the rabbis, their last question is, and Rabbi Meir, how did you learn Torah from the mouths of Acher? So what everyone here was thinking of, what is Rabbi Meir doing following this guy on Shabbat and learning Torah? And so here is what the rabbis say. Didn't Rabbi, the son of Rabbi Chana, say, Rabbi Yochanan said, right? So a long rabbinic tradition. What is the meaning of the verse? For my lips, a priest shall guard, knowledge and instruction they shall ask from his mouth, for he is an angel of Hashem of legions. So they're quoting this verse from the prophet Malachi. If the teacher is like an angel of Hashem of legions, they should ask instruction from his mouth. And if not, they should not ask instructions from his mouth. So didn't this rabbi say, you should only choose teachers who are angelic, right? If you're going to learn Torah with somebody, you have to choose somebody who's perfect, right? Only choose somebody who is like an angel of the Lord, right? So, I take this at face value, and I think this represents a view of only study with people who are perfect, right? And of course, the irony is that nobody's perfect. And so the rabbis go on, and Reish Lakish said, no, that's not what happened, right? Rabbi Meir found a verse and expounded it, right? So Rabbi Meir found another verse in the Tanakh from Proverbs. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise ones, and put your heart to my knowledge. To their knowledge was not said, but rather to my knowledge. Rabbi Chanina said, from here, listen, daughter, and see, incline your ear and forget your nation and your father's house. So Rabbi Chanina says, right, just, I'll read it and then I'll unpack, right? There's a lot of cryptic commentary happening here, right? He quotes an additional verse. This is also why, in general, Talmud study is so dense and frustrating, because the rabbis are just quoting from one source and another source and putting it off. So quoting this additional verse from Psalms and saying these two verses seem to contradict each other, right? In the one case, it seems like you are allowed to incline your ear and hear only the words of the wise one. And in another case in Psalms, it says, listen, incline your ear and forget your nation and your father's house, meaning go learn wisdom that you didn't get from home. There is no contradiction. This one, when there is no need for a teacher like an angel, is with an adult. And this one, when there is a need from a teacher like an angel, is with a child. So, the rabbis say, here is how we resolve all these contradictions. And if you didn't understand exactly how the verses were intersecting, don't worry about it. The rabbis are saying we have two competing traditions, one that says your teachers need to be perfect, the other that says, nope, go learn from everybody. And they say, well, when you have a child, probably better to put them with very simple and easy to understand teachers. But once you become an adult and you understand the world is more complicated, it's okay to learn with people that are complicated, because that is how the world works. And then when Rav Dimi came from Israel, he said, they say in the West, Rabbi Meir ate a date and threw away the kernel. So Rabbi Meir was able to take the wisdom, right, the good part from his teacher Acher, but throw away the bad part, the pit. That concludes the wider story of Acher. He shows up in a lot of wider cases, and the story of Rabbi Meir. Maybe next week we can, or the next time I do this, I think Rabbi Mati is doing next week, we could talk about Rabbi Meir, because he's a fascinating character in his own right. But here is the wider story of Acher. Mitch, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, the story is really interesting for me for another reason. We can accelerate to when I was growing up. As a young kid in Denver, my grandfather would always point out a great uncle among my cousins, a guy who just basically sat. He would read books. And my Zaidi said back in Russia, he was a renowned rabbi. He left. He became a communist in the United States. He had struggles with God, but he would keep kosher. He would do all the things, but he would sit there and he would argue and he would raise issues of interpretation. And eventually, most people sort of semi-ignored him because he was like a radical. But he was one of the most fascinating people I ever met, because he was very gentle. He was very kind. He looked like Achar, who would be very kind and say to a student, you better turn around now. I don't want you to go my path. And that was sort of like my Uncle Chaim, great Uncle Chaim, was when he would sit there and he would talk philosophy or stories, not necessarily Talmud, try to bring it into the world of what the Bolshevik Revolution was like, what communism looked like or should have looked like, because he thought Marx was a very intelligent man. My brother did too. And so these dynamics he would bring was fascinating, but he was really a trained rabbi who basically sat and told stories, and a lot of people listened to him, and that's how he lived his life in the United States.
Oh, I love that story. That's
Yeah.
so incredible. No, it reminded me of one of the texts that I find really interesting is there's a text from Freud, who is writing in the 1920s, I believe. Freud, obviously, very anti-religious, right? Religion is a neurosis and it's a delusion, and it's terrible, and it's just that was Freud's view. Freud is then asked to he writes I'm forgetting exactly which book. I think his famous book Totem and Taboo, which was his book about understanding psychology and everything like that. He was asked to write an introduction. The book in the 1920s gets translated into Hebrew, as a part of the early Zionist movement. And so they ask him to write an introduction to the Hebrew version of his book. And he basically says something that really reminded me of what you just said, where he says, it might be hard for the reader to understand, the deep felt emotion I have, writing this introduction. Everybody here knows, my views of religion, and I can't say I ever really tried to learn about Judaism. I don't speak Hebrew. I don't know any of the customs, but I feel deep in my soul that I'm a Jew. I've never felt otherwise. And it's just this fascinating, page and a half of introduction trying to explain his view. Let me try to find it, because it's really one of the most powerful, but that reminded me. Yeah, go for it. Oh, well, great seeing you, Mitch. Do we have any other Acher thoughts here?
I had sort of a backward thought that, I converted, and there was always this spiritual chase, and I was a poli-sci major and started to major in ancient political theory, and I'm just searching and searching, and I thought one of the most powerful things about Judaism was just to be grounded and do it. And some of it is like Asher kept looking and looking and looking for, these intelligent, these philosophical answers and these understandings of the world. Like you started at the beginning, I want to know how is the world created? Like what's going on? And what I really found so, that really drew me to Judaism was how it was so connected with the day-to-day and just taking care of people, taking care of what's going on. And so, I feel that conflict, and only later now I've gone back from studying all those intellectual things to, doing the grounded things and being a Girl Scout leader and being a parent, and then going back up. Now I have a more mature way of looking now at deeper stuff. And Fred always was way more Kabbalistic, and I was like, that makes no sense to me. And now it actually makes a lot more sense to me. But I think that's that whole push and pull of a lot of this. And just because you're confused doesn't mean you just throw it all away, and which is what Asher did. I found this very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. There's a book that now you guys have to get, because you kind of talked about it. It was by a conservative rabbi in the early 1900s, and it was called As a Driven Leaf. The rabbi's name was Milton Steinberg, and he wrote a historical philosophic novel based off of these Talmudic sources, and then turned it into a 400-page book about exactly what you're describing, about somebody who is searching for truth, and is going to Jewish communities and Greek philosophic communities, and at the end, I don't want to spoil the end, but fascinating implications for exactly what you're just saying, in terms of at the end of the day, Judaism has never really been about again, endless search for what is unknowable, but what we do know, which is we can better the world, we can better our community, we can, create more love in the world. And those are things we can do now. And that does have change. And so even if I can't promise you, I know what happened before creation, and so, okay, great. Plato and Aristotle can, debate their entire careers of, was the earth always here, or was there form that then, was there matter that was in given form, or, all of the ancient Greek debates. We've always said, okay, it's also really important, tzedakah and share, and that's a lot more tangible than all these. So, yes, highly recommend that book. Well, thank you all so much. I'm excited. I think Rabbi Mati and I are I don't know exactly how we're dividing it, but it'll be the same link, same time, and great stories about the Talmud. So thank you all, and I will see you all very, very soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Daniel.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.